just passing around a one-page handout about the encyclopedia. Paul's just completed an extraordinary 9 years project, putting together for the first time an encyclopedia of vernacular architecture of the world. This is truly a mammoth task involving contributors from all over the world, and is about to be published, and the handout tells you a little bit about the structure of the encyclopedia. Paul's had a long involvement with the AA. He was head of the graduate school in the early 1970s and remained involved with teaching and supervising in the graduate school for many years during the 70s and early 80s in the Housing and Urbanism program. More recently, he's been involved with Oxford Brookes University, basing the research for the encyclopedia there, and currently setting up a new master's program based very much on the ideas in the encyclopedia to deal more thoroughly in teaching about questions of anthropology in architecture and vernacular architecture. Some of us in the AA also know Paul because of music. Some of us have been lucky enough to be here when he's presented some of his work on the blues. Paul's wrote the great book, The History of the Blues, and sometimes comes in with piles of gramophone records under his arm and gives fantastic impromptu evenings which bring alive that music again. Still this evening, Paul's going to tell us about the process of making this encyclopedia and to raise very fundamental problems of definition and classification for this type of work. As the title of the lecture suggests, questions about building by whom, building of what culture, and buildings for what purpose. Paul.
Thank you very much, Hugo. I'm going to use some overheads a little later on, so at that time you might want to move forward a bit in order to see them. Had I had time, but it's been a very pressured period producing this encyclopedia, I would have probably made them into slides, but as it is, these overheads at least will illustrate some aspects that we'll come to a little later on. This talk basically is about the decision making that was necessary in order to compile this encyclopedia. It's a world encyclopedia, vernacular architecture in every part of the world, and that presented enormous problems. Problems to me as to anybody else who might embark upon such a subject, as even to know if anybody has done any work in, say, Siberia, for argument's sake, or Madagascar, on the vernacular architecture of those regions. So this was in itself a major problem, just finding the people to write on the subject. But prior to that, a number of decisions had to be made in terms of structuring and in terms, fundamentally, of what an encyclopedia actually had to do, in a sense, what an encyclopedia was for. The work was originally commissioned as a result of a book which I wrote called Dwellings, The House Across the World. It was commissioned by Blackwell as an encyclopedia of world vernacular architecture, and it seemed a good idea at the time, and so I accepted, but didn't quite realize the immensity of the subject nor the fact that it was going to expand enormously in the course of working on it. And this is really because there was no precedent. You see, although you may not think so, but most encyclopedias are compiled by ripping off at least 50% of other encyclopedias and then rejigging the information and updating it and so on and making it look as if it's new. But most encyclopedias are actually compiled that way, and I'm not revealing many secrets in the publishing business to tell you so. But there were no precedents for this encyclopedia, and well, it didn't take very long before I discovered why. However, having embarked upon the task, it seemed necessary to see it through. In point of fact, Blackwell found it was getting larger than they can cope with, and Cambridge University Press took it over, and Cambridge are publishing it in October this year in 3 very large volumes. But that's at the end of some 9 years of work upon the subject and full-time research in the field. As I say, this is not going to be a history of all that, but really just more a focus upon some of the decision making. And I think that in order to introduce that, I'd just like to show you a few slides, partly to act as a way, if not of defining the subject, at least in outlining the buildings that might fall within it. But people always do ask me to define the subject of vernacular architecture. And I suppose I would be seeming to avoid a critical issue if I didn't at least confront that just briefly with you now. So before going any further, I should suggest or imply that the term vernacular architecture is really a part of the linguistic analogy that's applied so frequently to architecture anyway. Those of you that know Peter Collins's work will know what I'm referring to, but the fact that we talk of the grammar of architecture, the syntax of architecture, the language of architecture, the language of postmodern architecture, and so on, all this is linguistic analogy. It has nothing to do with language, but we pretend that it does. And by doing so, we try to imply that architecture is rich and diversified and capable of freedom of movement and expression as language is. To talk of vernacular architecture, and the word has been in use since the 1850s, actually even earlier, but in not in considerable use since the 1850s anyway, it has implied that it is the language of the people, hence the architectural language of the people. And that suffices in a kind of way, provided you know who the people are and what an architectural language of the people might be. The test that I generally apply is a very, very simple one, which is one of prepositions, as I've suggested in this title. It is the architecture by the people, made by the people, constructed by the people, conceived by the people. It is the architecture of the people. But it is not the architecture designed for the people. There's a fundamental difference, and this I think actually will become apparent when I just show you a few slides. But the by, of and for, nevertheless, is a very useful device actually for testing quite a number of issues. If we had the time I would try and demonstrate that, but I probably won't be able to do so. But at least what we will do is see a few slides and at least just test this first premise. Many of you will have come to vernacular architecture, or at least know something about it, through Rudowski's book Architecture Without Architects. It performed a function. It did certainly draw vernacular architecture to a wider audience. I think it was an immensely damaging book because so many people have not advanced beyond the thinking of that mid-60s expression, which is fundamentally aesthetic. It was the building as cultural artifact, but an artifact to be admired at a distance, to be held in the palm of the hand. In a sense, it was a kind of patronizing view of vernacular traditions. It got no further than that. It also assumed from architectural aesthetics, at least of that period, some of the kind of hierarchy of scale. You know, great architecture, minor architecture kind of thinking, classical architecture. This was, Santorini, is the classical vernacular. That's kind of buried in the thinking of architects to a very large extent, emanating, of course, originally from Le Corbusier's journey to the Orient, in other words, to the Bosphorus, and a brief residence on Mykonos. But that, not only conditioning the colour of the interior of this room and that of nearly every architect in this room, I'm sure, the kind of white architecture concept about architectural form, but it also built in a particular view about the nature of vernacular tradition, something to be admired, something to be patronised, something to refer to show that your architecture relates to it, and not in any way to study it or understand it. So this has been a fundamental problem in actually the study of the subject, that in a way it was retarded rather than advanced by Rudowski's popularity. However, nevertheless, as I said, it broadened the audience, so to speak, if no more. Now, these are not vernacular architecture. This is what I would call popular architecture. its architecture is certainly worthwhile examining. In case you're unaware of it, Harley Sprague was the first person to devise a built logo, so to speak, a symbolic form for for filling stations, and this one is the earliest of them. But it's not neo-vernacular; it's imitative vernacular, if you like. I mean, it imitates the vernacular forms just as much as the funny little place on the right-hand side here, which is down in Surrey. But they've nothing to do with the vernacular. They may make comic references to the vernacular. They may joke with it, and this is not infrequent. There's nothing to do with it. It is popular architecture, and I'm not suggesting that popular architecture should not be studied. I wouldn't have written a book on the suburban semi-detached house if I didn't think that it's important to understand that phenomenon, but it is not vernacular architecture. Nor is any kind of attempt at a neo-vernacular, that is using Cape Cod forms in California as an example on the right. That's nothing to do with vernacular architecture. It's equally patronizing. It appeals to sentiment. It has nothing to do either with architecture or with the vernacular. Nor does the equally condescending view that Africans live in circular plan houses with conical roofs, but the trouble with African houses is that the buildings are made of straw and wood. If we make them of concrete, they'll last. Unfortunately, they did. These were built by the British railway management of the Sudanese railways at the early part of this century, and unfortunately they're still there, and they're likely to be there for a very, very long time. It's nothing to do with vernacular architecture. It is architecture for the people as perceived by architects detached from the culture. Now, it is necessary, I think, in the study of vernacular architecture to confront some major issues. Architecture is, for the most part, for nearly 100%, it is designing for the powerful. It is designing for power, it's designing for wealth, and it is not to do with designing for the community. Nor is it certainly anything to do with designing as a part of the community. Now, people find this very offensive, I'm sure, but nevertheless it's a reality that has to be faced. It's very interesting that just recently a study was made, published in BD, if nothing else you would have seen, which interviewed 200 major architectural firms in Britain, which made a hierarchy of the priorities or the most important factors in an architectural practice. To have popular appeal or consent was bottom in the list. Clients' feedback came back fourth. Actually, getting another job was, of course, I think, number two. But basically the point that I'm making is that okay, so architects may have very little concern about popular appeal or response to their design. In the vernacular, it is the building of the people and by the people. There's no question of being divorced from the community in such a way, no position that you can take that says, I'm not concerned with what the people think of my work, because essentially you are one of that community, and that is absolutely fundamental. It may be self-built or it may be community-built, but what is fundamental to it is that the architecture is the expression of the community itself and not divorced from it. So that this is a very fundamental issue, and is the reason why these buildings do not relate to the vernacular except in imitating its forms. Now, talking about the forms raises many issues, not least of which that of classification. One of the problems with an encyclopedia is that you have to find a form of classification. Now, one may resent this, but nevertheless it's fundamental to the nature of it, as it is in the nature of a dictionary. There's no way in which it can be both encyclopedia and not be an encyclopedia. In other words, it has to be classified, and the problem, of course, is how to classify. That classification is not necessarily evident when you finally receive your encyclopedia, but every encyclopedist has to do it. That is, you classify in order to find out whether you've covered the subject, whether you've got the balance right, and so on. You may then publish it as a simple A to Z. Now, I personally object to the A to Z structure. And if I was going to devote a fair amount of my life to compiling an encyclopedia, I certainly was not going to use what is called the single sequence encyclopedia, which starts with A and ends with Z. Because the classification is only dependent upon the accident of the initial letters, which may be quite different in another language anyway, and has absolutely no significance and no correlation between one item and its adjacent, its neighbour. There is a further problem, and a much more serious one in my view. It does not reveal the weaknesses of the encyclopedia, and if it has any kind of conscience behind it at all, it has to do that as well. In my view, it's got to demonstrate where the research is still needed, rather than camouflage by presenting it in such a way that it appears to be totally comprehensive, as most encyclopedias do. From my position, it is very necessary to demonstrate where work should be done, rather than try and fudge the issue and present it as if it has all been done. And a large encyclopedia can certainly be produced that gives that impression. Now, coming back to this issue then of forms, which I just referred to very briefly, one of the basic and most simple ways in which vernacular architecture is defined is very often just in terms of the forms that it takes. And it's a very convenient, easy handle. Or we describe it just by its structural system. So we may say timber frame buildings, or we may say half timbering, although that term has no meaning or significance at all. I defy anybody to demonstrate what half timber actually might mean. But nevertheless, I mean, it's possible to talk about these as different systems within a general overall picture. The only thing is that what it defines is nothing of very great help, because the buildings on the right are in Warwick, that on the left in Colmar. So that what we're looking at is the distribution of a particular kind of technical solution to construction, but tells us very little about the building beyond that. The comparison between, say, Warwick and Colmar is fairly dramatic, even though they're using very similar structural systems, apparently. But I think it's also very necessary to realize that even in what is apparently one idiom, and this is a very familiar one in most books on vernacular or sort of popular books and so on, Taos or Pueblos will appear. Yet the difference between the buildings of Taos and the buildings of Acoma, not terribly far away, is very, very fundamental to two different peoples who are Pueblo peoples building Pueblo structures. But not only are the buildings differently constructed, but also they have different meanings. We may refer to these as cubic structures, and this is the kind of term that, as I say, from a purely form point of view, is often used. You might refer to the one as adobe and the other one as clay lump or whatever. And this too is not infrequent as a kind of means of identifying forms of vernacular. It doesn't get us very far. It is very, very common to see references to African architecture as mud huts over and over again. I mean, on news reports, the people live in squalid houses made of, and they will often say, with roofs of straw. You know, it's very difficult to build a roof just of straw. But anyway, I mean, it's this kind of mud huts with roofs of straw. It's the kind of phrase which BBC reporters or ITV reporters and so will come up with over and over again. It tells us very, very little. If it goes a little further to the use of a common formalistic classification of the rondavel or of the circular plan or cylinder and conical roof, cone and cylinder is the most commonly used term, or the beehive house and so forth, whatever that might mean. These very, very common terms have, although defining by a very crude formal comparison, have very, very little validity. Both of these are cone and cylinder buildings on that basis. On the left, Kikuyu. On the right, Frafra in northern Ghana, Kikuyu in Kenya. The comparison is only that of very, very simplistic view of the overall form. It tells us nothing about either the way in which the buildings are aggregated, how they're lived in, whether this is a village on the right or whether it is in fact a single compound, which is exactly what it is. That kind of definition is virtually useless, and certainly on a world basis is of no value or application at all. But it leads us inevitably to a discussion of one of the other favourite ways of classifying vernacular architecture is by materials. Materials and resources. For example, Brunskill, one of the very few people to work through something like a coherent system based on Cordingley's earlier work. Cordingley Brunskill's system is unfortunately very, very widely distributed. The Handbook to Vernacular Architecture somehow seems to imply that this is the solution. It's based fundamentally on the distribution of materials. Now, therefore, it may be argued that structures arise by some intuition or by some determinist result as a result of the availability of certain kinds of materials. Let's say of euphorbia or Lilleshwa, as these buildings are actually constructed, and of earth or clay. The only thing is, in fact, these are not clay buildings. They are, in fact, clad with cattle dung. These Maasai do not use clay. They have an absolute direct resistance to the use of it. So this is, in fact, if you must, defined by construction. You can see the woman building the structure just inside here, just here. These are, in fact, both constructed and covered by materials very specific to the culture. Dung is used because this is a cattle culture, and there's a very, very strong bond between the people and the material. But even so, where do you get to if you define those buildings that are made of clay and those buildings that are made of cattle dung or clad with it or covered with it? I mean, this is a useless kind of approach, and it has very, very little validity as soon as it's placed on a world map. It may have some kind of validity on the Kenya map, for example. I think I should also just draw attention to the fact, as I say, it is the woman who is constructing this house. It leads us inevitably, nevertheless, to the matter of skills. And this is certainly a significant and important issue. I'm not suggesting that these should be the basis of the categorization or classification, nor, as indeed I've attacked the idea of form or materials as the fundamental basis of classification. But nevertheless, it should not be ignored. It is fundamental, and I'm not suggesting otherwise, only that it is not the basis for a classificatory system. So that here you may see people when not using a saw pit with a saw trestle, stone carving and so forth. The nature of the skills that are necessary in building in different parts of the world with different materials and different access to resources and skills is very fundamental. Even more so is the transmission or the passing on of skills. And one of the great tragedies of the late 20th century is the way in which skills have been denigrated, such that what will kill the vernacular is more likely the lack of transmission of the skills than it is on the loss of the buildings themselves. I mean, obviously they're interrelated, but there's no way of perpetuating it without perpetuating the skills and the abilities and the know-how and, in a sense, the inherited wisdom, which is fundamental to the maintenance of a tradition or its capacity to adapt. And certainly those skills are extremely refined using fundamental and basic materials, so that, as you can see, the steps in the house I was staying at the time are made of bamboo, with strips of bamboo also being used as a binding material. On the right, a Venezuelan, people call it kogi in Venezuela, a finely thatched roof of a quality that one finds in many parts of the world, though the materials of the thatch and the nature of the thatch and so on may be very different. It is possible to make comparisons. It is possible to plot the distribution pattern of, for argument's sake, pile houses, or of the use of pandanus. But what you learn from that, I think, is probably relatively little. I mean, it is certainly possible to do it, but unless it's put in conjunction with an enormous amount of other information, it doesn't provide us with very much in the way of either a system of classifying or a system of understanding. But all of these, fundamentally, as possible bases, which I'm in the process of demolishing in a sense, emanate in a way from though far removed, but nevertheless from architectural thinking. In other words, thinking about the nature of the building as artifact. And the question, of course, is that fundamentally right? Now, most architects, I would assume, expecting a history of architecture to be therefore about the history of buildings and of, let's say, technological innovation and so forth, but also perhaps of patronage or whatever, would therefore expect that any survey of vernacular architecture starts on the same premise. But I think we have to question that. And this is very fundamental. I don't think it's enough to actually looking at form, or to be looking at structural systems, or to be looking at materials and resources. All of those are contributory, but why do buildings exist in the forms that they do and the diversity that they do, such as we've seen demonstrated around the world? Some people would argue a determinist position, that there is a climatic determinism. But that can be demonstrated that clearly does not apply. There are climatic modifiers on building, but there's no climatic determinism, no suggestion that a particular kind of climate results in a particular kind of building. It can be demonstrated very, very simply in hundreds of examples that this does not apply. All one can say is that certain kinds of building respond to certain kinds of climate, but that's another story. So that kind of determinism, or the kind of determinism that says granite exists, therefore granite buildings will result, therefore those granite buildings are going to look like this and so forth, or take this form, similarly is not demonstrable. Partly because if granite exists, people don't necessarily use it, partly because even if they do use it, they may use it in very different ways. And they do use, what we need to understand is why the differences are there. And any kind of classification of vernacular architecture has to stem from that rather than stem from any of those basic elements which I've been referring to up till now. Accept them, yes. Cope with them, yes. But not use them as the fundamental basis on which the work should advance. And these are the kinds of problems that did confront me in terms of planning the encyclopedia. Now, one of the arguments might be one of climatic determinism related to environmental determinism. In other words, does the environment promote a particular kind of architectural response? In other words, is the nature of the Sahel, or is the nature of the lower half of Mongolia, for the convenience at this moment, we'll talk about those points a bit later on, will these result in a certain kind of architecture, a nomadic form of architecture, simply because it can't maintain a static community? And you could argue that, but there's a world of difference, obviously, between the skin tent of the Tuareg here, a 3 or 4 person structure, and the semi-permanent ger, or you probably know it better by the common but misapplied term yurt, on the right-hand side. Now, both of these are nomadic structures. Both of them are transported in a sense. Both of them use available resources in a way. The skin tent here is necessary because there is no other material from which to build the membrane to cover the roof, except or to make the roof, except the skins of the animals that are herded by the Tuareg. The structures on the right-hand side are in fact wool, but felted wool. These the covers here, the tent felts, are ultimately the product of wool in a sense, but yak wool. So you might say, well, there is a relationship between the material resource and the resolution of the structure. Yes, certainly. But what is the underlying principle? The underlying principle is that these are pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists, who need to move their structures and dwell for certain periods of time in locations over their territory. And that really begins to open up an alternative view. If I just may draw a line underneath this by saying, if we make simple comparisons between materials and structure, we get almost nowhere in terms of comparison or a basis for understanding of vernacular traditions. On the right-hand side, Malay house in Malay tropical forest. On the left, no connection between the two, just a superficial similarity. A prairie house in Kansas. There's no connection, none whatsoever. You may make some possible links in terms of climate or space and form and so on. If they do exist, they're of interest, but they're not the basis of any kind of serious analysis on and ultimately presentation of vernacular traditions. But that brings in an issue then, whether the fundamental basis is that of economy. If we're talking about pastoralism, that is a particular kind of subsistence economy. Are we looking therefore at an economic base to vernacular architecture? Will a comparison of economies actually result in a better understanding? I do think they would to a degree, but nevertheless a market economy can be expressed in a multitude of different ways. It isn't the market economy that decides that Kano takes the form that it does here. This is northern Nigeria, where also in Kano the workplace here in this case is the dyeing of cloths in indigo. There's no direct correlation between this and that, at least as far as architectural form is concerned. There is a direct correlation in that the merchants and the makers of this material live in these houses. In that sense there's a correlation, but in terms of a simple correlation in terms of this kind of economy results in this kind of building, there is no connection. So what then does determine this? Well, a multitude of factors, and we have no time to pursue those except to say that at least in part the forms that these now take are Islamized, and there has been a powerful external influence upon this region which is modified over a couple of centuries to produce an architectural form which is transformed to some extent from a different structural pattern to the compound to the current structural pattern to the compound, but in terms of relationship of component elements of living spaces, of those which are the household heads compared with those of the members of the family or the brothers and so forth, there's very, very little difference between them. We can come back to some of these issues a little later on if you want further clarification. I've remarked upon the issue of climatic determinism. Certainly, I don't think it's supportable to say that architectural forms result from climate, but one can say certainly that climates may be modified, or at least result in modifications of the architecture in the adjustments to climate, whether it is, as on the left-hand side, the Mishrabia, the kind of structure which happens to be sideways on, which is annoying. But nevertheless, it is fundamentally the same principle, namely of a screen which makes it possible to filter the air, filter the light, and also retain an element of privacy necessary in a particular culture. Or in the courtyard here in Isfahan, or in a domestic house, which has in the women's quarters here also the pool, also the trees and so forth, which help to cleanse the air and allow for the climatic sink principle of heat exchange to function effectively to keep a cool courtyard. Now, all of this certainly will help to account for the distribution of courtyard houses in different parts of the arid climates of the world. But it isn't ipso facto a direct result. It is a combination of a whole lot of other factors, not least in this case, as I say, matters of privacy or matters of separation of the male and female areas and so on, that are also part of the cultural determinants, if you like, of the building form, as well as those of the climatical factors that may have bearing upon it. Actually, we could sharpen it. Is anybody there? Just the left is getting a bit further and further out of focus. Yes, I think it might even sharpen a bit more than that, actually. What we can see is that sedentary peoples, and this is people called the Dai in Yunnan, southern China. With sedentary peoples, you will find that there's, apart from the buildings of the dwelling units themselves, and these are very characteristic Dai dwellings, large in scale, looking very perhaps old traditions still surviving. In fact, most of these have only been built in the last 4 or 5 years. Or you may find adjacent to them, or you will find adjacent to them, storehouses and pens for animals, stalls for granaries and so on. Very necessary part of economies which are moving from the subsistence to the market economy, but necessary for maintaining the crops and the goods, necessary also for storing them for eventual sale or barter. The vernacular, therefore, in shorthand terms, does not concern it, or is not solely that of subsistence economies or simple societies. It is also of complex societies, it's of market societies, it's of productive societies and so forth. What is fundamental to it is, fundamentally, it is the architecture of the people by the people, in a sense. And this is underlies all the principle, irrespective of the use of corrugated iron or whatever that may be the found materials or the available resource for these structures. What we're looking at is shops here, incidentally. On the left, a village shop. On the right, markets at Kumasi. This is in Ghana, Ashanti region. Now, I think another factor that we have to consider is I deliberately chose my words there and referring to this is Ghana, the Ashanti region, for this particular reason. It's very convenient and very common to classify vernacular architecture by the country of origin. It's the easiest and most comfortable way, and I have resorted to it for the purposes of explanation, or just for identifying buildings and so on as we've been talking. So that it's possible to say that this is architecture from South Germany, this may be North India, this may be Thai, or whatever it is, or I've said, or South China, for argument's sake, or southern Ghana, or the Alpine region, Switzerland. But you see, the problem with that is that we're then defining vernacular traditions by political boundaries. I'm very, very relieved that I chose not to choose that as a basis for the encyclopedia, because when I started, the Berlin Wall had not come down, East and West Germany were not unified, Czechoslovakia had not divided into Slovakia and to the Czech Republic and so on. Yugoslavia was not struggling to be Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on. In other words, if I had chosen as a basis the countries of origin, not only would this have been unwieldy. How do you take a state like Tuvalu with 50,000 people compared with, let's say, Russia? I mean, what kind of basis is this? Merely by taking national political boundaries. But I decided against that for the very reasons which I'd referred to there, but not knowing, of course, that there would also be the political upheavals that there have been since, which were made all a nonsense of those political boundaries anyway. And there will doubtless be others in the future, and I have no doubt about that at all. But the definition, there are 40 lines, or 70 depending on your definition, drawn with a ruler in Africa, bounding African states. So by definition, it depends on if you're taking one line to bound two countries or a boundary line between two. But either way, these are lines drawn by imperialist, colonial regimes. They have no relation to the cultural patterns of Africa. But they are very, very artificially constructed, and therefore they tell us remarkably little, except about politics. The example I'm choosing is not a political distinction, but simply on the left-hand side in the lowlands in Switzerland, on the right-hand side only 30 kilometers away or so forth in the highest village in Europe, Turbel. The forms that they take have some kind of correspondence, but quite clearly also very considerable differences. Under one roof, in the buildings on the left here, all the farm services, all the farm utilities, all the storage and the house are all contained. Up at Turbo in the Wallace Valley region, all are differentiated with separate storehouses and so on running along the contour. I only draw the attention here merely because both of them could be described as being Swiss. But also in Switzerland there are stone traditions, brick traditions, as well as the timber traditions, and the timber traditions themselves vary enormously between block bow, horizontal log construction, and timber framing and so on. So that basically a national definition does not work. There are also problems inherent, I should add, in terms even of trying to classify by culture, because you may attempt to classify by the nature of distinct cultures. And in order to do so, you may extract one particular most visible or evident aspect of the culture in order to use as a basis of classification. In this case, these are community houses. On the left, the Iban of Sarawak and Brunei. Long houses, which sometimes are up to 300 metres in length. Very few of those survive, but 100-metre houses are not uncommon. And certainly ones like this, which are about 30 or 40 metres, are numerous and contain whole villages. Or Tucano, Vopes, many of the peoples of Amazonia, also very, very large structures which contain whole villages within them. In other words, basically communities are only fragmented to a degree into family units, but cooperate and operate as a totality. So that one might be tempted, of course, to use family structure as a basis. The distribution patterns would not be sufficiently eloquent for you to use it as a basis for analysis of vernacular architecture as a whole. It begins to leave you wondering, well, what on earth could be? I think there's just one other point that I should mention on the way, incidentally, and that is a matter of diffusion. Because whatever we use as the basis for constructing, in my case, an encyclopedia, it has a certain static nature. Once you've actually pinned it down in terms of writing the text and so on, there's a curious kind of permanence associated with it. It's very necessary also to be aware not only of change, problems of constancy and change in traditions, but also of diffusion of cultural characteristics, which may take architectural forms. There's no question that much of the log construction, this was even my namesake, Isaac Oliver's house in Cades Cove, on the right-hand side here, but this horizontal timber construction is not of British origin. It has been argued that maybe there is something about the scale of the proportions that is of Scots-Irish origin, but that may simply be the limits of available timber. But one thing is certain, is that the kind of construction is Scandinavian and possibly, to some extent, Southern European also in influence. Now that, of course, is most easily demonstrated in terms of migration from Europe to the Americas. But peoples had been moving all over the world for hundreds and literally thousands of years, so that diffusion issues also are ones that have to be considered. And similarly, the parallel to diffusion. I can't help feeling that Freudian slip had a lot of significance. Parallel to that is that also of change, of transmission, certainly, that is the passing on of tradition, but also change within the tradition. What we're looking at here is Serbian, in fact. Both the traditional Serbian storehouses and houses and their traditional ways of roofing, the alternative which came in of immense shakes or wooden slats, and these slowly being replaced by tiles. Now, we may consider that as some people do, as somehow the loss of tradition. I personally take no romantic view about it. This is a process of change. What is fundamental, actually, is how the society operates, whether these intrusions or these changes are reflective of changes in the society or merely the availability of materials or the longevity of materials, in other words, merely the shrewd adoption of materials where they are appropriate. Fundamentally, it's the culture and its patterning which is going to be the only basis or foundation for discussion, it seems to me. And I came to this conclusion in the course of the first 18 months or so of working on the subject. Cultural patterning takes all kinds of expression, and as soon as one rids oneself, in a sense, of using architectural form or of materials or whatever as being somehow the basis for the criteria for inclusion and the way in which the subject is approached, and use a more cultural basis, then a lot is revealed. So, for example, if we're looking at in this instance, or these instances, Nepalese people call the Nur, what we're actually looking at is both old buildings and recent buildings of the Nur. But what we actually are perceiving is the kind of classification which relates to the spirit world in terms of a Nur, which keeps the animals at the lowest base and right up the very top. You can just see it on the right-hand side. The kitchen, as a transformative process, cooking is the closest to the gods. Just below that, on the upper level, are where the weaving rooms are, which are a transformative process only second to that of cooking in terms of its relationship to the gods. Now, this hierarchical structure is fundamental to Nur housing. I haven't the time to go into the details, merely that once one understands something about the cultural basis, then one can understand why the Nur build high in an area where they need not do so, why their proportions of their windows and so on are graded in the ways that they are, and why what we would assume to be the kitchen, which may often be isolated from the main house or an adjunct to it, suddenly appears on the roof, and why this is fundamental to both Nur belief and to Nur culture. So that, in a sense, cultural factors are fundamental to the understanding of the vernacular. And that applies both in terms of belief systems which inform domestic housing, and most of what we've been discussing is domestic up to now, but also to religious buildings or buildings used for religious purposes. On the left here, a small chapel on the day of Semana Santa in Costa Rica. On the right, a puja, morning offerings at a small temple in India, near Agra. I mean, they're just random examples, in a sense, of religious belief, but obviously belief according to factors which are built deeply into the cultures concerned, and which are fundamental to the way in which the culture operates, and in terms of its values attached to its buildings and to its religious buildings in particular, and to cultural observances. One of the notions about vernacular architecture is that somehow it's never unnecessary, that everything that is constructed is simple and architecturally valid and necessary. This is a usual kind of architect's romantic fiction. Many vernacular buildings are in fact quite unnecessary from any point of view of a simple rationalist definition. At another level, they are necessary, but necessary in terms of either spiritual life or in terms of status or hierarchy or values that are important within the culture. But it is necessary to understand the culture in order to be able to understand what those values are. So that the very, very richly decorated houses of, in this case, Sana'a in the Yemen, do demonstrate quite a lot about the nature of the society, of the wealth of the owners of the houses, of the particular importance attached to the mafraj, to the men's room and so forth at the upper levels and so forth. I mean, all of this is in fact actually drawn out for you on the buildings, and we may look at them purely as decoration. They actually carry a far more important weight of meaning. Here, Mindanao, just one of the peoples at this very moment likely to lose their architecture and their culture as a result of Australian investment in copper mining in this region. But these extraordinary buildings are constructed on tree trunks, as you can see, but then with these very rich embellishment and decorations that we see, and we may just regard them as decorations rather than, in fact, as depictions of different kinds of naga or snake deity and so on. Fundamental in terms of the values attached to the building to be there and to be depicted, but not necessary in terms of the architectural structural integrity of the building. Can only be understood in the values of the society and not outside it. But then vernacular architectures of the people, by the people, for the people, but only within the people, if you wish. And these are what I would call the prepositions, in a sense. Now what I want to now look at is another series of issues, and I'll just use this final slide. The amazing, extravagant buildings of the Toraja of Sulawesi, you may know it as Celebes, of immense scale, and we may admire their structural splendour and exaggerated forms and so on. In fact, what they are, actually, these are bison horns. Really, the water buffalo is the deity of the Toraja, and you can see it depicted on the front of the building here. All these decorations, which we may regard as being so rich, every convolution, every volute and so on, has a separate meaning, and is to be read on the building. And the building only achieves its full maturity and full significance when it is decorated with this language of symbolism expressed upon the building, as indeed is the case of the tie beams that you'll see on these structures. Each one is decorated, each decoration carrying a weight of significance on these, what are fundamentally ancestral buildings. Now again, I can't go into the details of that much as I'd like to, but this is just a very general talk. The problem is, and the problem I had to confront is, if we compare this with, let's say, that cone and cylinder building of the Kikuyu, if we look at the skin tent of the Tuareg, and we look also at the timber frame houses of the Kalmar, how do all these come together in any kind of description of the world's vernacular architecture? Remember, the world's vernacular architecture, I generally say, is 90% of the world's buildings. It's probably around about 98% of the world's buildings. It is the world's buildings. The architect designed buildings hardly count in terms of the volume of architecture in the world. The vernacular buildings are what the world's buildings are, fundamentally, and the way that the rich and the poor are divided now and will continue to be, and ever more extremely in the 21st century, I suspect that will continue. That's another story. Let's come to the next issues. So first we can have the house lights on, unless I can manipulate them from here. Oh yes. Oh yeah, I should have just mentioned that. This does raise a question, which I'm often asked about. What about squatter settlements? Are they vernacular or not? And this is a very interesting issue, and it's not easily resolvable. In the study of vernacular architecture, there are fringe problems. The transition, for example, from the vernacular to what has been termed the polite threshold. Not a term I like, but anyway, it is, the first indications of external design. How far does that penetrate the vernacular? And in terms of squatter settlements, to what extent are they vernacular if they are self-built, if they are of the community, and so on? Here, I think a conservative policy of wait and see is probably necessary. And what I mean by that, in fact, to qualify it, is that certain traditions, such as the Gejikondo, the mushroom housing of Ankara, have definitely developed as an independent vernacular. But others, such as these very temporary dwellings along the Hooghly River in Calcutta, are literally only temporary, and the photograph is of buildings that no longer exist, having been completely demolished under World Bank auspices. But just to the right here, nevertheless, that kind of spark of hope, the little shrine where daily puja is still said. And this actually suggests the continuity of cultural values rather than the continuity of the structure as being fundamental. And it's to this I wish to turn now. Right, let's see if we can get this illustration. So, first of all, are there any questions on any of the points that I've raised today, up to the present? How are we doing for time? Are we? Yeah. Okay. 20 minutes, half an hour, okay? Yes. No, I wouldn't call Taj Mahal vernacular architecture. I mean, it was designed, after all, for a very specific purpose and designed as a cultural artifact. I think there is a distinction here, because really it was, if you like, a very wealthy man designing a building as a shrine to his wife's memory. I wouldn't see that as essentially part of vernacular tradition. I mean, it is part of a tradition, that's another story, but not a vernacular building. Yeah, I think probably not all of it, but a very large proportion of it. 19th century, say, terrace housing, suburban housing, and so on, speculative housing. I would see that as part of popular architecture. As I say, I mean, it is in itself a very important area, but it is still designed for an unknown client. It even determines, as the suburban semi to a very large extent did determine, the way in which housing was to be, but the community had no say in it except to buy it. But it had certainly had no recognition. There's very little recognition between suburban housing, say, in Belfast and Kent, of any cultural distinction between them. I mean, they are speculators' interests, but they were not really taking into consideration the interests of the community insofar as it was different from one to another. Whereas in the vernacular traditions, it's actually fundamental to it, and must therefore accommodate not only its present but its future.
Well, all the examples you've shown us obviously exist at this moment or did recently exist. Have you looked at the historical development or an archaeological development? Because obviously in Britain, the Anglo-Saxons did something that we might call vernacular architecture. We've something to do about it.
I promise you that this was not. I promise you that this was not actually a plant, because I'm just coming on to that very issue. No. So I'll try and answer it by the next point that I was going to make. First of all, what I've been showing you, just very briefly, is examples of vernacular traditions. Some of these have a history, some of them we know nothing about that history, some we can define a history, and sometimes a history of extraordinary age. That is, for example, it is possible, say, in the old Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia and so on, to find at and subsequently evidence of traditions going back 3,000 years in vernacular architecture, but in other words, commenced and still survives in terms of architectural form. Even the pueblos that we were looking at, some of those have survived for 1,000 years. So that, and there is documented history of one kind or another, archaeological or sometimes textual, to support this. Other forms of vernacular architecture have no kind of historical evidence whatsoever that we can be sure of. In other words, there are traditions, and sometimes these may be recounted, but often that research has not been done. So what I felt was necessary is to draw a line, and that line would be drawn where research began in the subject. Research really begins in the 1880s with Mindeleff in the United States actually working on pueblos. But really, vernacular architecture research to any great extent only really begins in the 20th century and only takes its maturity and surprisingly recently, post-Second World War. This is not to say there wasn't work done before, there has been, but it's a very uneven pattern. And really, much vernacular research, I mean, the kind of research is now being conducted all over the world, really began in the late 1960s. So that, that being so, a lot has been lost. What I decided was that we would look at the vernacular architecture as it has survived into the 20th century. By survived, and preferably survived in use into the 20th century. In other words, that is recallable, and which had a reference point in research on the vernacular traditions which are discussed in the encyclopaedia. Now, if there is historical evidence to support that, then that can be introduced into an entry. If there is no historical evidence to support contentions, that can be stated. But the essential thing really was to say, well, these are living traditions within this century. And that I used as a fundamental baseline. It's not to ignore the archaeological research, but it is perhaps to question an archaeological approach to some vernacular architecture studies. Now, what I would like to, at this point, in these odd 20 minutes or so that we have left, just to move into another stage. What I've tried to describe is how, for me, it eventually emerged that there was really only one fundamental basis that one could use, and that was a cultural one, to the understanding of cultures, and as buildings as an artifactual product of cultures with the particular qualities of the nature of a specific culture being the contributory factors to the architecture which it produces. Now, this then questions, who are the architects who've done that research? They are very small in number, and they generally start from an architectural position. Understandably, that's their job. Now, if you open up the book, in a sense, and look at other people who are working on vernacular architecture, what's extraordinary is how large the range is. In the first instance, anthropologists have made more contributions to the study of vernacular architecture than architects have. Often they're inadequate in architectural terms, but what they tell us about the nature of architecture within vernacular contexts is far richer in terms of anthropological research than it has been in architectural research. Now, if we take these two, it's also evident that archaeologists, especially ethnoarchaeologists, who are looking at contemporary or 20th century surviving cultures and comparing these with the, and this is now done in a very refined way, very crudely at first, but now in a much more refined way in terms of archaeological evidence, then archaeologists have also had a lot to contribute. As indeed, obviously, have historians in certain regions, especially when access to the historical record is rich or can be or has been researched. Now, what I've found is that if the prepositions, the by, of, and for, were fundamental to an understanding of vernacular architecture, that the prepositions are also fundamental to the way in which it's presented. We have to acknowledge the fact that the research is not all done by architects, unfortunately, nor is it all done by anthropologists, unfortunately. It is in fact done by geographers and by planners and by people involved in development issues in a wide diversity of disciplines. What I decided to do was to have, at the beginning of the encyclopedia, at least a statement of approaches. And these are approaches about which authors have written. In other words, the whole encyclopedia opens with the approaches of, say, cognitive psychologists interested in the cognitive nature of the perceptions of architecture, perceptions of environment and dwelling space and so on. maybe, say, ethnologists, and ethnologists are concerned with artifactual description as distinct from anthropologists who are concerned actually with cultural definition, so that there is a fundamental distinction. And ethnologists obviously make more use, in effect, because of their descriptive process, of architectural techniques, in a sense. So each of these areas, and some of those are interest groups, and some of those are clearly disciplines, and some of them are concepts. By that I mean that if you are an archaeologist, you belong to and use the methods of a particular discipline. If you are a historian, you do so. If you're a museologist, you are using a number of disciplines for a particular kind of purpose. I mean, that is for the artifacts within, say, the open-air museum, or to approaches to conservation. There's not necessarily a discipline, but it nevertheless uses a number of disciplines and brings them together. Or they may be purely conceptual, that is, spatial approaches have been developed by geographers and also by planners and also by students of development studies, so that spatial approaches, in fact, have actually, especially as revealed by geographers, have advanced the study of vernacular architecture very considerably. You need to know the literature. And for me, not only the problem of knowing the literature, but also knowing the people and even finding them was very fundamental to the problem of the whole issue of compiling the encyclopedia. So what I wanted to just give you an example or two of the kind of issues I'm referring to. In other words, the people, say, of Madagascar appear to all produce simple rectangular houses with just a gable end and a ridge roof. What is of considerable importance to us is that they're conceptualized very, very differently. In fact, every house in Madagascar, amongst a wide variety of cultures, Antandroy, Sakalava, Siwa, many others, conceptualize space as a zodiac, and space, internal space, as time, a progression not only of the days but also of the months, and the progression of the connotations of each month. Now this is extremely important, but very, very difficult to unravel. How did it get there? 50% of the people of Madagascar are Indonesian in origin. Did it come through Indonesia? But the terminology is Arabic. Did it come through the dhow trade down the African coast? This is still a matter of considerable speculation and perplexity. But one thing is certain, is that if you look at the houses of the Sakalava in Madagascar, you'll never understand how the people conceptualize their buildings from merely describing their form or the materials which they're constructed of. Geographers have quite different approaches. Here, for example, just by way of example, just looking at the distribution of shotgun houses in the United States. This is part of Jackal's research. Now, we may find this particularly odd. All I'm saying is that a different disciplinary position perceives architectural features in a different way and maps them conceptually in a different way. That is, in terms of distribution patterns, in terms of diffusion patterns, in terms of cultural entities, and geography, or geographers, especially working in this kind of field, have revealed a great deal to us. But much of that is unfamiliar, I suppose, to most people here. Now, over and above that, there is the issue of what is comparable within cultures. If we are talking about studying cultures, do we look at each culture as separate and discrete? Are there any common elements? Now, one of the problems for the encyclopedia, inevitably, is if you are describing how the buildings are constructed, that's obviously necessary, it's part of the architecture, you have a real problem of constant repetition. That is, if they're constructed of bamboo, there's only a limited number of joints that you can make with bamboo. And although these are handled very ingeniously in different parts of the world, nevertheless there are limitations on it. There are limitations on the number of ways in which pandanus leaves can be used. You ultimately reach the threshold. Do you go on repeating that information? It seemed very necessary, in fact, for the first part of the encyclopedia, and therefore in Volume 1, to concern itself with the underlying theories and principles. The first of these in terms of commonalities between cultures. And therefore I drew up a basic list of cultural traits which can be considered to be commonalities, that is, commonalities, say, of language. Linguistically they're going to be different, but all cultures have language, and often largely defined by language. All cultures have social structures. All cultures have kinship relationships. And all of these have bearing upon the architecture. This, therefore, is not a list of cultural traits per se. It's a list of cultural traits that have bearing upon architecture, architectural space, the ways in which buildings are conceptualized and used. So this, too, is one of the introductory aspects of the encyclopedia. If I, therefore, show you the outline of the first volume, you'll see that the approaches and cultural traits and attributes are introductory in a sense. And then it moves into a discussion of issues which we have been concerned with here: environmental, materials and resources, production, services, symbolism, decoration, also typologies, and also that very important aspect of typology, namely uses and functions. Now, each of these has a subset, and one of the requirements of the publisher was that it should be alphabetically related. So what I had to devise was a three-tier system which would be alphabetically related, so that approaches, cultural traits, environment, materials goes down to uses and functions are in fact in alphabetical sequence. If it had been functions and uses, they'd have gone in the wrong place. But one of the beauties of the English language, and the more you use it, the more you discover it, is the number of ways in which you can manipulate a word or a group of words to get them in an order that suits what you need. And one of the need that I had was to get them in alphabetical sequence. But not only that, I also wanted them to be logically related. I was told again and again, this is impossible. Well, it almost is, but it's 80% possible. So that production and components, if I had called that construction, then construction would have come after cladding. But if I call it assembly, then assembly precedes cladding. This was just a little manipulation of the words. Ultimately, it should not be in any way transparent. I'm revealing to you what should in fact not be at all evident. I mean, in other words, you use it. But nevertheless, ventilation and cooling and water supply placed between sanitation and water supply had more sense than placing the cooling, it seemed to me, immediately after cooking and heating. I mean, there's another possibility, but it seemed to me that there was a logical relationship that I could demonstrate, sometimes in some cases more crisp and clear than in others. But nevertheless, it did mean that it is possible to read a whole section of the encyclopedia as an entity. Now, just in case you think that these are single entries, that's not the case at all. Under, say, ventilation and cooling, will be a whole set of entries. Each one is 650, 700 words or whatever, and will be on an aspect or several aspects of the subject. It can't be totally comprehensive, and there is a clear problem as to how much you deal with the subjects in generalities and how much you deal with them in specifics. I decided it was best to probably compromise and do a little of both. So for the Mishrabia that we were talking about is discussed here in an entry on Mishrabia, because Mishrabia are to be found in Iraq, they're to be found in Sudan, they're to be found in Egypt and so on. And it's a widespread, under different names, they're Raushin or whatever they may be, there are different ways of filtering light and dust and air on buildings in many parts of the Arab world. They justified a separate entry. But others may be rather more localized, but still of considerable interest and possibly of eventual use in how can I put it, in information transfer or technology transfer, in terms of some of the techniques of roofing ventilation used in South India, for instance, or of laying of brick structures in order to allow air circulation and so on, but not penetration by hands, and so on. So that under ventilation and cooling, a very large number of different ways in which ventilation and cooling systems are used in different parts of the world are discussed. So that is the way in which the encyclopedia is constructed in that first volume. And in the second volume, as I mentioned, there are the cultural traits, and they in turn also are discussed, but within culture areas. And the biggest problem to me was, how do you define a culture area? Just to give you just a glimpse at the nature of that problem. Hope this will work. Yes, right. What you're looking at here, sorry, getting seasick. This is a tribal map of West Africa. This is a cultural map of West Africa. It doesn't look remotely like the map of West Africa as you may have in your mental image of Nigeria, Dahomey, Togoland, or at least Burkina Faso, or whatever. You see, in other words, if we take, for example, I mentioned the Ashanti a little earlier on, adjacent people, the Ewe, Ghana goes right up through all these peoples. Hardly one of them, except just between the Dagomba and the Tem, is the only one where there's actually the political boundary coincides with the juxtaposition of two cultures. In all others, the cultures are divided. In other words, the political boundaries have no bearing upon the cultural map. On the other hand, the cultural map is immensely complex, and in fact, it's only been done for Africa. It has not been done anywhere else in the world. So that much of this has boundary lines where there are clearly no boundaries in point of fact. So it seemed to me that it was very necessary to try and find out what kinds of methods of cultural mapping there have been. One of them is that of linguistic mapping. And this is of considerable interest. But linguistic mapping actually groups cultures according to the language families. But of course, as we know, that doesn't necessarily follow. North America has many languages, and language families related to culture are not necessarily directly correlated. So that there are problems, and these have been attempted by Cynefin and Russell and others in their cultural worlds theory to identify cultural areas related to, well, different worlds, as they call them. Unfortunately, they were very inconsistent in the way in which they mapped the world. So they called the dry world, which is largely Arabic, but not wholly so, was one kind of term, whereas, in other words, European world was really much more political in implications. It wasn't, I mean, they attempted the structure, and they identified what they called shatter zones, which were really areas where they couldn't resolve exactly which culture world the people might lie. So in a way, it was sort of dodging the issues. Now, most of this work was done in the 1950s, and very, very little has been done since. So what the human relations area files have done is simply to list cultures. And that is pretty daunting, to say the least. And I mean, this is only the letters D to H in the cultural area files. This is at Yale. But their map is absolutely inscrutable, and I found of absolutely no use at all. Their classification of the world, which I did have, but I seem to have lost it now, I tried to trim things down a bit, was one which I felt I could not use. So I had to do my own cultural mapping. And this has gone through a number of stages and divisions. But what I endeavoured to do was to make, and these are inevitably a series of compromises between cultural areas where cultures share some commonalities, cultural areas which also share some architectural commonalities, because this was obviously a fundamental linguistic definition does not necessarily correlate to architecture. In fact, I have a postgraduate student working on precisely that issue at the very moment, because we just don't know whether in fact there are linguistic and architectural correspondences or not. But I couldn't make the jump to assume that that was so. So that the purpose of this was to actually identify cultural areas which have some cultural homogeneity, which may reflect to some degree some political boundaries, but not necessarily so. If they corresponded, all well and good, but if they didn't, then they don't. In other words, it is not a political map, and that will undoubtedly cause some offence, but it can't be helped. If I just look at how that might work, for instance, here is, by way of example, Malaysia and Borneo. Now, you see, Borneo is partly Indonesian, yet Borneo cultures in Kalimantan are definitely part of the homogeneous cultural characteristics of the Iban of Sarawak, which I referred to earlier on, of the longhouse type. They don't correspond with other Indonesian patterns. The fact that part of Borneo is part of Indonesia is purely political, but it is not cultural. So this is just as part of Sarawak, well, all of Sarawak is part of Malaysia, but it's questionable the degree to which they share any commonality of culture. There are certain elements, but definitely others that are not similar. There is more close relationship between the Iban of Sarawak here with the Kayan in Kalimantan here than between the Iban and the Orang Laut in Malaysia, for argument's sake. So this was a necessary distinctions that had to be made, and they will undoubtedly cause problems. But prepared to go along with that, and what I just thought I'd just show you is just how this works out in practice. So let's take the adjacent area of Indonesia East as distinct from Indonesia West, and you'll see, sorry, I was looking at it wrong. That's very strange, isn't it? Okay, let's have a look at that. That's right. What we're looking at is the opening of the section on Indonesia East. So roughly that begins at Bali, which is just here, just off the map in the extreme east of Indonesia West. Why? Well, because Bali is Hindu, and because the extreme eastern end of Java is also partially Hindu. But it could be argued that Lombok to some extent is as well, and the 20-mile strait between the two. But then the cultures change as one goes through peoples like the Atoni and so on, or up through Moluccas into Halmahera. All this is a part of a cultural unity, and therefore could be handled together, including even peoples like the Toraja that we were talking about at the end of the slides. So what is the effect of that? Well, the effect of that is at least to demonstrate just such a people as the Toraja here. Now, this is preceded by a discussion on the Toraja as a culture, but also the particular nature of the roof structure. So this is discussed in some detail, but as you can see on the in the margin here are the cross-references. The cross-references to 175G3 symbolism, and under that you will find Toraja symbolism is also discussed. There's also a cross-reference to the symbolic triad being black, white and red, which is the symbolic triad, which is very, very widespread in cultures all over the world, and is expressed also in the Toraja. In fact, you saw that in the decoration of the outside of the Toraja building to which I was referring. I didn't refer to the colour triad then, but that is discussed in the encyclopaedia as a whole, so, and its application by the Toraja. So in other words, people like the Toraja is discussed architecturally and culturally in this part of the encyclopaedia, but is cross-referred to its discussion under symbolism or discussion under colour and so on. So that's how it basically works. It has obviously the key, but it also has the basic references. The number of references on the Toraja are far greater, but amongst the most important, and I've just mentioned there, Gaden's Dominic. Dominic wrote the standard work on the diffusion of the roof systems of Southeast Asia. Johan Kistjovac is a Dutch writer who, with Raima Sheffield, Nui Palm made the classic study of the Toraja, and Roxana Waterson, whose more general work, but anthropological work on the living house, it's called, the houses of Southeast Asia. So that this directs the reader to three main references. Other references he'll be directed to from symbolism or whatever, to Nigel Barley's recent work and so on. So that's how it works. The encyclopedia then takes basically a cultural premise, absorbs the architectural issues, because that is, after all, fundamental to its purpose, but uses the architecture as an element within the cultural description, and then any special features of it are discussed in detail, and any general references to technologies or techniques which are common with other cultures take the reader back to the first volume and save repetition. So fundamentally that's how it works. That ought to make it fairly short. It makes it 1.5 million words of text, and a further 0.2 million words of references and so on, and that's the reason why it's taken 9 years to do. I guess you've had enough. If you are interested, and if you haven't got a leaflet on it, you're very welcome to have one. If by any chance, it is going to be very expensive, therefore if you're connected with a library who you think should have it, even if you can't afford it, there is a special offer with a £70 reduction, and I can give you a leaflet on that. If you're interested in studying vernacular architecture from the positions that I've been referring to, or know somebody who might wish to for a master's degree, there's also a leaflet on that. After which commercial, I think I've moved from the vernacular world into the miserable world in which we live, and at that point I should leave off.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take them if there are.
Well, I shall never be able to use the word vernacular loosely again. It's very profound and tremendously important work to define this. Other questions people would like to raise while we still have Paul with us?
Yes, certainly.
Do you actually think that vernacular architecture is being put somewhere organic then?
Sorry?
So are you saying that vernacular architecture is somewhere organic?
No, I'm not suggesting it's organic, no. But then the definition of the term organic is in fact used by architects in a way which no biologist would use it. So that the problem, of course, first of all, is one of definition. But if one is thinking that somehow things grow, this becomes very close to that view about vernacular architecture that somehow it's intuitive. I mean, this was the kind of position that has been taken, from Adolf Loos on, that somehow vernacular builders work a little bit like bees, by some deep intuition that's imprinted in them that has nothing to do with thought. Anybody who ever works with vernacular builders very rapidly discovers they know exactly what they're doing. And that's how, and of course it's fundamental. You don't have to think about it for very long to realize that they cannot transmit to a subsequent generation skills, knowledge, know-how, how to cope with conditions and so on, unless they have a clear picture of what they're doing. So that the notion of the organic as being somehow a kind of biological process independent of thought, I don't think applies. But if one thinks of it in terms of accretive, that often does apply. In other words, many vernacular traditions are constructed in such a way that the building may start off with 2 or 3 cells and be added to, or even lose with changing nature of the structure of the family. As the family grows or it decreases. And that does apply in certain traditions, but not in all of them. So I wouldn't like to even hold that as a model universally, you see. I mean, I think it's a model that would be supportable in certain specific examples. Any other queries?
You made the point, Paul, that a very large proportion of buildings in the world are vernacular by your definition. And I wonder whether you, having had this sort of overview now, you sense that there is an erosion of vernacular, perhaps a change to popular and to eating away of both the skills within the culture, but also the cultures themselves. So can you perceive that there is an erosion going on in the reproduction of vernacular architecture?
Yeah,
and if so, is it something which architects, in that we are interfering in built form all over the world, both by reference and by direct building, that we should be aware of and should do something or can do anything about?
Well, I think that there is a kind of subtext to the whole encyclopedia anyway. I mean, I wouldn't have devoted this much time to it unless I also had a kind of missionary zeal behind it. At least in part it's related to this issue. And that is that I think interventionist policies have often been extremely damaging to the vernacular. Architects have a contribution to make. Certainly in terms of skills of information transfer and developed technologies and so on, especially if these are economically viable within societies, so that societies can meet aspirations appropriate to the age, whether it's the late 20th century or the next century. But on the other hand, there has been erosion, and that erosion, at least in part, has been political. The case of Romania is, obviously well known, but in many, many parts of the world, vernacular traditions are denigrated by governments and by official policies, and also, of course, I have to say, by architects and planners also. But not universally, but that is definitely the case. On the other hand, one of the compensating aspects which is of great interest is the fact that many vernacular traditions have gained strength in competition with the pressures against them. So the Toraja buildings are actually more remarkable, more dramatic now, just by the self-assertion of Toraja identity. Than they were 40 or 50 years ago. Interestingly, that is a tradition which has gained strength by the fear of erosion and its confidence in its own architecture and its assertion of its identity. But not all societies are capable of standing alone, in a sense, in that way, and often are subjected to all kinds of pressures, economic, governmental, and so forth. And some of these are, to say the least, quite appalling in their ruthless application. Often vernacular traditions are seen as being somehow primitive or archaic or not 20th century and so forth, not appropriate to an aspiring society, and yet they're still depicted on the postage stamps. In other words, they still become symbols of the culture, only provided they're kept within a little enclave or museum. I think, however, that the 21st century will not result in much advances in world housing generally. Why do I think so? Well, because there are 700 million people in the Indian subcontinent alone, and some estimates place it even higher. What kind of housing policies are ever going to cope with numbers of this kind, let alone exponential growth? What kind of housing policies are going to cope with Chinese populations already nudging over 1 billion people, likely to be 2 billion before we pass the middle of the next century? What kind of housing policies are going to be applied that do not support and advance, in a sense, vernacular traditions, skills, knowledge of the use of materials, building wisdom? It seems to me that architects who somehow feel that they can apply the solutions or work for governments in order to annihilate vernacular traditions and replace them with mass housing. You only have to see in the surroundings of Ibadan or whatever the terrible disasters achieved by 1960s thinking about architectural mass housing, the enormous damage that has done to cultures. To be able to confront an issue which, if architects are to make any kind of contribution, it must be with the understanding of the indigenous values, qualities, positive elements within the cultures and what cultural aspirations are, rather than impose them. With that constraint, I believe that, or with that at least wisdom, I think it is possible to make contributions that are valid and worthwhile. But otherwise, I think we are contributing to the very erosion that you're referring to.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. In Western Europe, I'd say vernacular architecture is almost, it's a historic thing. If you don't include what I would have thought of as a sort of vernacular, in other words, say the builder's terrace house, which I would have thought was actually acceptable to ordinary people very frequently and had some approximate to their sort of
No, the point is very valid.
Doesn't exist anymore.
I mean, the point is very valid, and I'm not arguing against it fundamentally. I am, after all, talking about a worldview of vernacular traditions, and certainly it could be argued that these have declined markedly in Western Europe. What is surprising is how recent that decline is. I mean, that is, buildings by any standard, vernacular buildings, are still being built in Brittany in the 1950s. I mean, we've lost so much in so short a time. All over Central Europe and so on, buildings were constructed in vernacular traditions well into the 1950s, and obviously before the Second World War. Extended. It is true that in our corner of northwestern Europe, that probably does apply. And we have, in a sense, disenfranchised the people by, in fact, handing over entirely to speculative builders, and I think, and also legislating against self-build, or only under very, very strict constraints. Now, up to a point, I mean, there are all sorts of factors in terms of population density and conservation of the landscape and so on. We can't ignore all these things in a society which has gone the way it has. But we should not then use those as a criteria for applying to the rest of the world, which, in view of the fact that so much of the rest of the world has been influenced very much by Western ideas in terms of technology, or in the case now of the electronic revolution, it's very easy to see that those ideas about the vernacular are similarly applied elsewhere, whereas in fact I would think that would be not valid. Sorry, I think you had a question. Okay. No.
Any more questions? We'll go up to the bar if anyone wants to carry on discussing with Paul. We could do so over a more congenial surroundings. Thank you again, Paul, for a very good.
It's not that